Right after the storm ended, a dog stayed behind. Not barking, not moving on, just waiting outside an abandoned cabin while the road below turned to ice. No one knew who he belonged to or what he was guarding, but before the day was over, that quiet decision to stay would force someone else to choose whether to walk away or follow. The storm had passed, but winter still held the mountains in silence. Snow lay heavy across the forest, softening every sound, pressing the world into a stillness that felt deliberate, almost watchful. The cabin sat just beyond the tree line, half buried, as if the mountain itself had tried to forget it. It was an old wooden cabin, the kind built decades ago by hands that valued function over comfort. The logs were dark with age, the corners squared and practical, the roof pitched steeply to shed snow. The front steps were covered, but not evenly. Some of the snow had been disturbed, compacted by recent weight, then lightly dusted over again by drifting flakes. That detail mattered. It suggested time had passed, but not too much. The door was closed, but not locked. Inside, the air was cold enough to sting the lungs, yet it carried the faint trace of human presence. A wool blanket lay folded on a chair, not carefully, but with the distracted neatness of someone who intended to return. On the small table near the window sat an empty mug, its rim marked by a thin line of dried residue. A lantern rested beside it, unlit, its wick unused. The room was orderly, but not finished. This was not abandonment by choice. It was interruption. There were no voices, no footsteps, no movement beyond the slow settling of wood adjusting to the cold. Outside the cabin, the forest stretched away in long, quiet lines of pine and fir. Branches bowed under snow. The road that once connected this place to the rest of the valley lay several hundred yards downhill, narrow and now invisible beneath a hard glaze of ice. After the storm, no vehicle could have safely climbed back up. Anyone who had reached this cabin during the blizzard would have known that leaving again would not be simple. Near the doorway, a dog sat in the snow. He was a German shepherd, large and mature, the kind of dog whose strength came not from youth but from experience. His coat was thick, black and tan, with a heavy ruff around his neck that caught the snow like a mantle. Flecks of gray touched his muzzle, subtle but unmistakable, marking him as older, 7, perhaps 8 years old. His posture was upright but not tense. He did not pace, he did not whine. He sat with his weight balanced evenly, front paws aligned, ears alert but relaxed. His eyes were dark and steady. They did not wander. They moved with purpose. First to the cabin door, then down the slope toward the frozen road, then back again. This was not confusion. It was vigilance. The dog did not remain motionless all the time. Every so often, he rose and walked a short distance into the trees, nose low, checking the wind, the snow, the faint traces left behind by the storm. He never went far. He always returned to the same place, settling again in front of the cabin, as if drawn back by an invisible boundary he refused to cross. Hunger would have come and gone in waves. Cold would have seeped deep into muscle and bone, yet his behavior showed no signs of panic, no frantic searching, no wasted energy. Whatever had brought him here, whatever kept him waiting, it was stronger than discomfort. Inside the cabin, the quiet pressed heavier as the hours passed. Light shifted slowly through the narrow windows, turning the snow outside from blue-gray to pale white. The fire pit remained cold. There was wood stacked neatly against the wall, dry and ready, but untouched. Someone had planned to light it. Someone had expected to stay. The absence of that person was not loud. It was precise. The dog lifted his head when the wind changed, nostrils flaring slightly. Somewhere far below, the mountain creaked as ice settled. He listened, then lowered his head again, placing his chin briefly against the snow before straightening once more. He did not lie down fully. Not yet. If a stranger had passed by at that moment, they might have mistaken him for a guard dog, left behind to protect property long forgotten. But the dog's focus was not on the cabin itself. It was on what the cabin represented: shelter, return, continuity. The road remained empty. As daylight thinned toward afternoon, the temperature dropped again. Shadows lengthened across the snow, filling the forest with blue. The dog shifted, rising to stretch his hind legs, favoring one side just slightly before correcting himself. Age and cold made their presence known, but they did not slow him. He stepped forward, nose brushing the bottom edge of the door, inhaled once, then sat again. Inside, the blanket remained untouched. Nothing in the cabin suggested chaos, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. This was not the scene of violence or sudden disaster. It was the aftermath of a choice delayed too long or a decision made under pressure. Someone had believed they had time. The dog did not. As the first stars began to appear above the trees, the forest grew quieter still. Snow muffled the world into something intimate and unforgiving. The dog's breath fogged the air in steady rhythm. Each exhale rose and vanished, leaving no trace, just like the footprints that had already begun to soften around him. He waited, not because he did not know what to do, but because what needed to be done had not yet been completed. And until it was, the cabin would not be empty. The road had once been nothing more than a narrow ribbon cut into the mountainside, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. Now it was a single sheet of ice, pale and unbroken, sloping downward from the cabin and disappearing into the trees below. Snow from the storm had melted just enough during the brief daylight to refreeze overnight, sealing the surface into something slick and unforgiving. From the cabin porch, the descent looked manageable. Up close, it was not. The dog stood at the edge where packed snow met ice, his paws testing the surface before committing weight. He shifted carefully, claws scraping faintly, then stepped back. His ears angled forward, not in fear, but calculation. This was not terrain that forgave mistakes. One slip here would carry a body downhill with no way to stop. The absence of tracks told its own story. No tire marks, no boot prints, nothing recent. Whatever vehicles had used this road before the storm had done so days earlier, when the ground still had grip and the weather offered some margin for error. After the blizzard, the mountain had closed itself off. The dog moved along the shoulder where snow still clung in uneven ridges, nose low, following faint human scent that drifted and broke apart in the cold air. The smell was old, thinned by time and wind, but it was enough to confirm what the cabin already suggested. Someone had come this way and had not gone back. He paused near a bend where the road narrowed and leaned sharply toward the drop-off. Beyond the edge, the land fell away into trees and rock, a descent too steep to climb without equipment. The dog sat, tail resting against the snow, eyes fixed on the curve. His breathing slowed. This was a place where decisions had been made, where hesitation could have cost someone their footing. In his mind, there was no narrative, no sequence of cause and effect. There was only memory layered with instinct. He had walked this road before the storm, when the surface was rough but stable. He remembered the sound of boots crunching beside him, the familiar rhythm of a human gait. He remembered stopping here, the human hand resting briefly against his shoulder, the unspoken signal to wait. He had waited. The cold pressed deeper as the afternoon wore on. Shadows crept across the ice, dulling what little contrast remained. The dog stood and began to move again, choosing his steps with care. He did not attempt the center of the road. He stayed close to the margin, where snow softened the edge, where a misstep might be corrected. Farther down, the road leveled slightly, opening into a shallow turnout half buried by drifts. Here, the ice bore marks that were almost invisible unless one knew where to look. A shallow scuff, a disrupted patch of snow refrozen into rough texture, evidence of a stumble, not a fall. Someone had slipped here and recovered, using the bank for leverage. Someone determined enough to keep going despite the conditions. The dog lowered his head and inhaled deeply. The scent strengthened for a moment, then thinned again as the wind shifted. It led forward, away from the cabin, away from shelter. He did not follow it all the way. Instead, he turned back. This was not retreat. It was assessment. Whatever had happened beyond this point had not ended here. If it had, there would have been more signs, more disturbance. The dog understood absence as clearly as presence, and what was missing now was the human. He climbed back up toward the cabin, muscles working steadily against the incline. The effort warmed him slightly, though the cold remained constant, biting through fur and skin alike. At the top, he paused, looking once more toward the road before settling near the doorway again. Inside the cabin, the temperature had dropped further. The wood stove was still cold to the touch. The stacked firewood remained untouched, each piece dry and ready. Whoever had stayed here had planned to use it, had expected to return inside before nightfall made the effort more costly. The plan had not unfolded that way. The dog lay down briefly, tucking his paws beneath him, conserving heat. His eyes remained open. Every sound carried weight now, the crack of ice shifting, the distant creak of trees adjusting under snow load. Somewhere far below, the faint echo of wind moving through a ravine. As darkness approached, the road below vanished into shadow, its dangers hidden but unchanged. If anyone had tried to walk it after sunset, the odds would have turned sharply against them. The dog knew this in the way animals know slopes, surfaces, limits. He rose again, stepping to the edge of the porch, staring down the frozen path as if willing it to give something back. The road did not answer. What it offered instead was certainty. No one was coming up from below, not tonight, not until the ice broke or the weather shifted enough to allow safe passage. Whatever had taken the human away from the cabin, it had done so without the option of easy return. The dog settled once more, positioning himself so he could see both the door and the descent. His body formed a quiet line between shelter and danger, between what had been and what might still be possible. The mountain had closed the road, but it had not closed the story. Night arrived without ceremony, the way it often did after a storm, slipping quietly between the trees and settling over the mountain. The cabin windows darkened to mirrors, reflecting only snow and shadow. Cold deepened, no longer sharp but steady, the kind that claimed energy slowly and without warning. The dog remained where he had positioned himself earlier, just off the porch, angled so he could see both the cabin door and the slope where the frozen road disappeared. He did not lie fully flat. His chest stayed lifted, muscles engaged, conserving heat while remaining ready. Snow gathered along his back and melted into his fur, then froze again in fine crystals. Waiting was not passive. It required constant adjustment. He shifted his weight as numbness crept into his paws, lifting one at a time, flexing toes before setting them back down. His ears moved independently, tracking sounds too faint for human hearing. The distant crack of ice settling, the soft collapse of snow sliding from a branch, the low wind threading through a ravine below. Each sound was evaluated, catalogued, dismissed, or held. He did not expect the human to return tonight. That understanding had settled earlier, when the road went dark and the temperature dropped past the point where exposed skin could endure. What he waited for now was change. Light, movement, anything that altered the equation the mountain had imposed. Inside the cabin, the air grew colder still. The door, though closed, was not sealed tightly. A thin line of frost crept along its lower edge. The dog rose and nudged it once with his nose, not hard enough to open it, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The interior offered shelter, but not resolution. Whatever mattered was not behind that door. He returned to his place and sat again. Time lost definition in the dark. Hunger came in brief flashes, then faded. Thirst was a more pressing sensation, a dryness that tightened the throat. Snow was available, but eating too much of it carried its own risks. The dog took small mouthfuls when needed, careful, measured. At some point in the night, clouds thinned and stars emerged between drifting gaps. The moon rose late, casting pale light across the clearing. Under its glow, the cabin looked smaller, less substantial, a temporary structure clinging to the mountainside. The road below reflected faintly, a dull ribbon of ice with no promise in it. The dog stood and walked a slow circuit around the cabin, checking the perimeter. His tracks overlapped older ones, compressing snow that had already begun to harden. Near the back wall, he paused, nose pressed close to the ground. The scent there was different. Weaker, diluted, but distinct enough to hold his attention. It did not lead downhill. It angled instead toward the trees beyond the cabin, away from the road entirely. He followed it for several yards, stopping at the point where the forest thickened and the terrain began to slope unevenly. Rocks hid beneath the snow here, roots twisted just below the surface. This was not a place for speed or certainty. The scent wavered, broke, returned faintly, then disappeared again. The dog did not push farther. He turned back, not because the trail was unimportant, but because it was incomplete. Whatever had drawn the human away from the cabin had done so cautiously, perhaps deliberately, perhaps under conditions that demanded attention elsewhere. This was not a frantic flight. It was movement with intent. Back at the porch, the dog sat again, this time closer to the door. His body formed a barrier against the wind that crept along the ground. Snow gathered against his side, building a shallow drift that insulated more than it hindered. As the night wore on, fatigue pressed harder. His eyelids lowered briefly, then lifted. Each time he allowed himself a moment of rest. It was shallow and alert, the kind that never fully releases control. Just before dawn, the cold reached its lowest point. The mountain held its breath. Frost thickened on exposed surfaces, and the snow underfoot hardened into a crust that would soon bear weight better than it had the day before. The dog sensed the shift not through thought, but through feel, the subtle change in resistance, the way sound traveled farther now. Light crept slowly into the sky, turning black to gray, gray to blue. The dog stood. He shook once, sending ice crystals scattering from his coat, then stepped forward to the edge of the clearing. He faced the road first, scanning the descent. Nothing had changed there. No new tracks, no sound of engines, no sign of approach. Then he turned toward the trees. This time, when he moved, it was not to wait. He stepped away from the cabin, nose low, following the faint direction he had tested during the night. Each step was deliberate, placed where the snow supported his weight best. He did not rush. Speed would have been wasteful. What mattered now was precision. Behind him, the cabin remained as it had been, quiet, cold, incomplete. Ahead lay uncertainty, shaped by terrain rather than ice. The dog did not look back again. Waiting had carried him through the night. Morning demanded something else. Morning light filtered through the trees in thin, uneven bands, catching on ice crystals and turning them briefly to silver before fading again. The forest ahead was quieter than the night had been, as if the mountain itself had settled after holding tension too long. Snow that had been loose and deceptive hours earlier now carried a thin crust, firm enough to support careful movement. The dog moved steadily, nose low, body aligned with the faint trail that had drawn him away from the cabin. Each step was chosen, not rushed. He adjusted his path to avoid exposed rock and buried roots, favoring ground that held his weight without collapse. The scent he followed was weak but consistent, altered by cold and time, yet unmistakably human. It led him downhill, but not toward the road. The terrain here was different from the open slope near the cabin. Trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking above, limiting light and trapping cold air near the ground. Snow lay deeper in pockets, untouched by wind. The dog slowed further, aware that uneven footing could conceal more than discomfort. Injury here would not announce itself loudly. After several minutes, the scent shifted. It no longer carried the direction of movement alone. It lingered. The dog stopped, lifting his head slightly. His ears angled forward, not rigid, but focused. He circled once, then again, narrowing the area. Beneath the snow, something had changed the pattern, disturbed it, pressed it down, then allowed it to settle again. He pawed gently, testing resistance. The surface gave way more easily than it should have. The dog stepped back, then leaned forward again, using his nose to clear loose snow in short, controlled motions. Beneath the white layer was darker material, fabric, wet and stiff from cold. He did not dig frantically. There was no urgency in his movement now, only certainty. The human was here. Partially sheltered by a fallen tree and a shallow rise in the ground, the man lay on his side, body angled awkwardly, one arm trapped beneath him. Snow had accumulated across his back and shoulders, blending him into the forest floor. His jacket was dark, heavy, the kind worn for outdoor travel rather than comfort. A tear along the sleeve revealed layered fabric beneath, damp but intact. The dog moved closer, sniffing carefully at the man's face. Frost clung to the man's beard, short and graying, his skin pale but not waxen. His breath was shallow, barely perceptible, but present, alive. The dog did not bark. He nudged the man's cheek once, then stepped back, assessing. The man stirred faintly, a low sound escaping his throat before fading. Pain had settled into him deeply, the kind that dulled awareness rather than sharpened it. This was not a collapse from exhaustion alone. The position of the body, the angle of the leg beneath him, suggested a fall, controlled enough to avoid immediate fatal injury, but damaging enough to prevent standing again. The frozen ground had done the rest, leaching heat steadily, mercilessly. The dog circled, then stopped at the man's back, pressing his body against him, sharing warmth without smothering. He stayed there for several seconds, adjusting until contact was steady. It was not comfort in a human sense. It was function. The man's breathing steadied slightly. Time mattered now. The dog lifted his head and looked upslope toward where the cabin lay, hidden beyond trees and terrain. The distance was not great in miles, but it was significant in effort. More importantly, the cabin alone would not solve this. The road remained impassable. No one would come unless someone went for help. The dog stepped away. He paused once, nose brushing the man's hand, then turned and moved back along the path he had taken, this time with purpose, sharpened by clarity. His pace increased, not into a run, but into a steady, efficient trot. Snow cracked softly beneath his paws, the crust holding where it had failed before. As he climbed, the forest opened gradually, light increasing with elevation. He did not stop to check the cabin when it came back into view. He passed it, angling instead toward the frozen road beyond. This was the choice. The road was still ice, still dangerous, but daylight had improved visibility. The crusted snow along the edges offered marginal traction. It would not be safe, but it was possible. And possibility was enough. The dog moved onto the road carefully, hugging the shoulder, claws biting where they could. He did not look back again. Whatever lay behind him was now anchored by certainty. What lay ahead was risk, measured and accepted. The mountain did not resist him this time. Below, the road bent and disappeared toward lower ground, toward connection, toward help that had not yet arrived but could. The dog continued, body aligned, breath steady, carrying with him the weight of what he had found beneath the snow. The truth was no longer hidden. Now it had to be carried forward. The dog moved down the frozen road with measured urgency, every step placed where the snow offered the slightest grip. The daylight had strengthened, but the cold had not loosened its hold. Ice still glazed the surface, reflecting pale light in a way that concealed depth and danger. The dog stayed close to the edge, claws scraping quietly, body low and aligned with the slope. Distance mattered now, not miles alone, but time. As the road descended, the mountain began to soften. Trees thinned, the grade eased, and the ice broke into rougher patches where gravel pushed through. The dog increased his pace slightly, breath steady, rhythm efficient. He did not stop to rest. Whatever strength he had was being spent deliberately. Several bends later, sound returned to the world. Faint at first, the distant hum of an engine idling unevenly, the muted clank of metal against metal. The dog slowed, lifted his head, ears forward. The scent of fuel reached him, sharp and unmistakable. A pickup truck sat pulled off near a maintenance turnout, hazard lights blinking weakly against the snow. Beside it stood a man bundled in winter gear, bent over an open hood, his movements stiff with cold. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built solidly from years of physical work. His beard was thick and dark, flecked with frost, his face lined not by age alone but by weather. When he straightened, his eyes were sharp and alert, the kind that noticed movement even when the mind was focused elsewhere. The dog stepped into view. He did not bark, he did not rush. He stopped several yards away and held position, posture controlled but unmistakably intentional. The man froze. Years of living in remote country had taught him to read animals as carefully as terrain. This was not a stray wandering for food. This was a dog with a message. The man closed the hood, wiped his gloves against his coat, and crouched slightly, making himself visible without appearing threatening. "Hey there," he said quietly, voice low, steady. "You all right, buddy?" The dog turned and took several steps back up the road, then stopped and looked over his shoulder. His gaze held. Then he moved again. The man did not hesitate long. He climbed into the truck, engine coughing before catching fully, and eased back onto the road. He followed at a careful distance, tires crunching slowly over ice and snow. Each turn revealed more of the mountain's narrow spine, the dog's form always just ahead, never far enough to lose. When the cabin came into view, the man pulled to a stop. The place looked empty at first glance, just another forgotten structure buried by winter. But the dog did not stop there. He passed the cabin without pause and veered toward the trees beyond. The man cut the engine, grabbed a heavy coat and a thermal blanket from the back seat, and followed on foot. The forest was quieter here, snow deeper, footing uncertain. The dog slowed slightly, ensuring the man stayed with him. They reached the fallen tree where the snow lay uneven. The man saw the shape beneath it and moved faster, dropping to his knees beside the injured body. He pressed fingers to the man's neck, then leaned close, listening. A breath, shallow but present. "Hey," he said, voice firm now, "stay with me." He worked quickly but carefully, checking limbs, noting the position of the leg, the stiffness already setting in. Hypothermia, exposure. But not too late. Not yet. He wrapped the blanket around the man, tucking it tight, shielding him from wind. His movements were practiced, efficient, shaped by experience rather than panic. The dog stood close, watching, ears forward, body still. Together, they moved the man onto a makeshift sled fashioned from a tarp and rope pulled from the truck. It was slow work, muscles straining, breath coming hard in the cold air. The dog stayed near the man's head, occasionally stepping forward, then back, as if maintaining position rather than assisting directly. By the time they reached the road again, the sun had climbed higher, light sharpening the edges of the world. The truck engine roared to life once more, and the man was lifted carefully inside, heat slowly beginning to reclaim what the mountain had taken. As the vehicle pulled away, the dog ran alongside for several yards, then slowed. He stopped near the cabin turnoff, standing in the road, watching until the truck disappeared around the bend. Only then did he turn back. The cabin waited as it had before, but now its purpose had changed. It was no longer a place of interruption, but of resolution. The dog stepped onto the porch and sat, breath steady, posture easing for the first time since the storm had passed. He had gone. He had returned. And because of that, the mountain had let someone go. The truck disappeared down the mountain road, carrying warmth and life away from the cold. The dog stood still for a moment, then turned back toward the cabin and sat where he had waited through the storm, his breathing finally calm. The mountain was quiet again. He didn't stay because the storm trapped him. He stayed because someone needed him to. And if you think back to the beginning, to that silent cabin and the frozen road, the answer was there all along. If this story gave you something to think about, share it with someone who might need it today. Tell me what moment stayed with you the most in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where small choices change everything.